What happens when one of Wall Street's sharpest minds walks into a network television interview and refuses to play by the usual rules? That's exactly what unfolded when Scott Bessent, the billionaire hedge fund manager and newly appointed Treasury Secretary nominee, sat down with George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America. This wasn't your typical softball political interview. This was a masterclass in how to handle hostile questioning. And before we get into the absolute fireworks that erupted on live television, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on in this debate. The tension was palpable from the very first question. George leaned forward in his chair, that familiar prosecutorial tone already creeping into his voice. The one he perfected during his years in the Clinton administration and refined over decades of grilling politicians and public figures. Secretary nominee Bessent, thank you for joining us this morning, George began, his voice carrying that deceptive politeness that journalists use right before they go for the jugular. Let's get right to it. Your nomination has been controversial from the start. Critics say you represent everything that's wrong with the current economic system. A billionaire hedge fund manager who made his fortune betting against the very economy you're now being asked to manage. How do you respond to those who say you're fundamentally unqualified for this position? Most politicians would have stammered, offered some rehearsed deflection, maybe thrown in a personal anecdote about their humble beginnings. Scott Bessent did none of those things. He simply smiled, the kind of calm, confident smile that comes from spending decades in rooms where billions of dollars hang on every word you say. George, with all due respect, that's not a question, that's a talking point, Bessent replied, his voice measured but firm. And it's a particularly lazy one. Let's address the substance here. You say, I bet against the economy. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of how markets work. When I managed money, I identified inefficiencies, mispricing, and systemic risks. Sometimes that meant taking short positions, yes, but more often than not, it meant identifying opportunities that created value, generated returns for pensioners and teachers and firefighters whose retirement funds I managed. And yes, sometimes it meant sounding alarm bells about policies that were leading us toward economic disaster. George's eyes narrowed slightly. You could see him recalibrating, reaching for his next line of attack. But you personally profited when markets crashed, when ordinary Americans lost their homes, their savings, their livelihoods. That's not a talking point. That's a fact. It's a fact without context, which makes it misleading, Bessent shot back, not missing a beat. Here's the full picture. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, yes, some of my positions did well because I correctly identified the housing bubble and the systemic risk it posed. But do you know what I did with those insights? I warned regulators. I wrote memos that went to the Treasury Department, to the Fed, outlining exactly what was going to happen if they didn't act. I was ignored. So yes, I protected my investors because that was my fiduciary duty. But I also tried to prevent the crisis. And now you're asking me how I'm qualified to manage the economy? I'm one of the few people who actually saw the last crisis coming and tried to stop it. George wasn't backing down. But you're asking the American people to trust that you'll prioritize their interests over your own financial interests, over your Wall Street buddies, over the very system that made you a billionaire. Why should they believe that? This was the moment that started going viral within minutes. Bessent leaned back slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge that cut through the studio. George, I'm going to stop you right there, because this is exactly the problem with how economic policy gets discussed in this country. You're trafficking in class warfare rhetoric that sounds good on television but obscures the actual issues. I don't have Wall Street buddies I'm looking to enrich. I'm not in the hedge fund business anymore. I've divested from my positions, put my assets in a blind trust, and committed to transparency standards that go beyond what's legally required. But more fundamentally, Your question assumes a zero-sum game, that what's good for financial markets must be bad for ordinary Americans. That's economically illiterate. You could see George bristling at that last comment. Economically illiterate? That's quite a charge. It's an accurate one, Bessent continued, completely unfazed. Healthy financial markets, properly regulated financial markets, are the mechanism by which capital gets allocated to productive uses. They fund small businesses, they fund innovation, they fund infrastructure, they fund the mortgages that help families buy homes. The question isn't whether we should have financial markets, it's how we structure them. George shifted in his seat, clearly regrouping. He pulled out a sheet of paper, a move that always signals a journalist is about to deploy what they think is their trump card. "Let's talk about your record more specifically," George said, his voice taking on that tone of someone who thinks they've got a gotcha moment loaded and ready. "In 2016, you made a series of statements about government debt that seemed to directly contradict the policies you're now proposing. You called the debt, quote, a existential threat to American prosperity, end quote. You advocated for immediate austerity measures. Now you're proposing policies that independent analysts say will add trillions to the debt. How do you explain that reversal?" Bessent didn't even blink. "I don't have to explain a reversal because there isn't one. Context matters, George. In 2016, we were in year 8 of an economic expansion with unemployment below 5%. That's exactly when you should be paying down debt and building fiscal space for the next crisis. We didn't do that. Instead, we kept spending like we were still in a recession. That was economically malpracticed. Now, the context is completely different. We're facing structural challenges that require significant investment in infrastructure, technology, and human capital. The question isn't whether we spend money, it's what we spend it on and what returns we get. Productive investment that generates growth can more than pay for itself. Wasteful spending that doesn't generate returns is what creates debt problems." "But that's convenient, isn't it?" George pressed. "When you were criticizing government spending, it was a Democratic administration. Now that you're being nominated by a different administration, suddenly debt doesn't matter as much." "That's a lazy political attack masquerading as analysis," Bessent shot back, his voice hardening slightly. "And frankly, it's beneath you. I've been completely consistent. Good fiscal policy is counter-cyclical. You run surpluses during expansions and deficits during downturns. You invest in things that generate returns, and you cut things that don't. That's not partisan. That's basic economics. If you want to criticize the specific investments I'm proposing, fine. Let's have that debate. But don't impugn my motives, because you can't win on the substance." George looked like he'd just been slapped. "I'm not impugning your motives. I'm questioning your consistency. By suggesting I've changed my views based on political convenience, that's impugning motives," Bessent replied coolly. "Look, I understand this is how the game is played in Washington and in media. You find quotes from different contexts, strip away the nuance, and try to manufacture hypocrisy. But I'm not playing that game. Every statement I made in 2016, I stand by. Every policy I'm proposing now, I can defend on the merits. If those seem contradictory to you, it's because you're not thinking carefully about the economic context." George tried a different approach. "Let's talk about monetary policy then. You've been critical of the Federal Reserve, suggesting they've kept interest rates too low for too long. Yet you've also proposed policies that would likely require accommodative monetary policy to avoid triggering a recession. How do you square that circle?" "It's not a circle that needs squaring," Bessent responded. "The Fed has a dual mandate: price stability and maximum employment. For years, they prioritized asset price inflation over real economy outcomes. That was a mistake that contributed to wealth inequality and financial instability. What I've advocated for is a return to rules-based monetary policy that focuses on those core mandates rather than trying to micromanage the economy or backstop every financial market hiccup. As for fiscal policy requiring monetary accommodation, that's a false dichotomy. Good fiscal policy, the kind that actually generates growth, gives the Fed more room to normalize rates, not less. But during the last rate hiking cycle, we saw exactly what I'm talking about, Bessent interrupted. The Fed was so far behind the curve because they'd maintained emergency policies for years after the emergency had passed. They created the conditions for inflation, then had to slam on the brakes, causing unnecessary pain. That's not what I'm proposing. I'm proposing we get ahead of these problems, rather than constantly reacting to crises we should have seen coming. George leaned forward again, sensing an opening. You talk about seeing crises coming, but let's discuss your track record. Your fund had significant exposure to European sovereign debt during the crisis. Some reports suggest you lost considerable sums before eventually recovering. Doesn't that undermine your claim to prescience? For the first time, Bessent's expression showed a flash of something, annoyance maybe, or perhaps just surprise at the depth of research. First of all, those reports are inaccurate. We were early on European sovereign risk, which meant we endured some mark-to-market volatility, but our ultimate returns on those positions were substantial. Second, this actually proves my point. The market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, as the saying goes. Being right about the ultimate outcome doesn't mean you don't face challenges in the interim. That's true in markets, and it's true in policy. The question is whether you have the conviction and the analytical framework to stay the course when things get difficult. Some would call that stubbornness rather than conviction, George countered. Some would be wrong, Bessent replied simply. Conviction based on rigorous analysis is different from stubbornness based on ideology or ego. I've changed my mind many times when the evidence warranted it, but I don't abandon well-reasoned positions just because they're politically unpopular or temporarily out of favor. George shifted tactics again. Let's talk about inequality. The wealth gap in America is at historic levels. You're part of the 0.1%, the 0.01% actually. How can someone in your position possibly understand or address the challenges facing working-class Americans? This was clearly meant to be a knockout blow, the kind of populist framing that's become standard in political interviews. Bessent's response was surprisingly direct. You're right. I'm wealthy. Very wealthy. I'm not going to. George took a breath, clearly deciding whether to escalate or pivot. He chose to pivot, but his voice still carried an edge. Fine. Let's talk about those tough questions then. Productivity, stagnation. What's your plan? Bessent seemed almost relieved to finally discuss substance. Productivity growth comes from three sources: technology adoption, human capital development, and efficient capital allocation. We're failing on all three. Technology adoption is being strangled by regulatory frameworks designed for the industrial era. We need modernized regulations that protect consumers and workers without preventing innovation. Human capital development requires education reform that focuses on skills employers actually need rather than credentialing that mainly serves the education industry. And capital allocation is being distorted by a tax code that favors debt over equity and financial engineering over productive investment. Those are broad principles. What are the specific policies? George pressed, finally asking the kind of question that might actually inform viewers. Specific policies. 1. Comprehensive reform of occupational licensing that's keeping millions of Americans from finding work in fields where arbitrary requirements serve no public safety purpose. 2. Expansion of apprenticeship programs modeled on the German system, funded through tax credits for companies that participate. 3. Elimination of the debt tax shield that incentivizes companies to load up on leverage instead of making equity investments. 4. Streamlined permitting for infrastructure and energy projects that currently take years longer in America than in comparable countries. 5. Reform of the patent system that's being abused to stifle competition rather than protect innovation. I can keep going if you'd like. George was scribbling notes, seemingly caught off guard by the level of detail. The occupational licensing reform, won't that face massive opposition from professional associations and unions? Of course it will, Bessent acknowledged. Every reform faces opposition from people who benefit from the status quo. That's why it requires political courage. Do you know that in some states, it takes longer to become a licensed hairstylist than it does to become an EMT? That's not about public safety. That's about limiting competition. And it's particularly harmful to lower-income Americans who can't afford expensive licensing requirements. But unions would argue those requirements protect workers from exploitation, George countered. Then let's have that debate on the merits, Bessent replied. Show me the evidence that requiring 1,000 hours of training to braid hair protects anyone from exploitation. Show me how requiring a license to arrange flowers serves the public interest. These requirements exist because concentrated interests benefit from limiting competition, not because they serve workers or consumers. And the people who pay the price are those who can least afford it. George shifted to another topic. You mentioned energy transition. How do you balance environmental concerns with economic growth? That's a false choice, Bessent said immediately. The question isn't whether we transition to cleaner energy. It's how fast and through what mechanism. A well-designed carbon pricing system would create market incentives for innovation while generating revenue we could use to compensate displaced workers and communities. Instead, we've opted for a patchwork of subsidies and mandates that distort markets, enrich special interests, and make the transition slower and more expensive than it needs to be. So you support a carbon tax? George asked, clearly surprised. I support pricing externalities, yes. Carbon emissions have social costs that aren't reflected in market prices. Basic economics says you should internalize those costs. But it needs to be done intelligently, with border adjustments to prevent carbon leakage and with the revenue used productively rather than just growing government. And it needs to be part of a broader energy strategy that includes nuclear, natural gas as a bridge fuel, and continued innovation in storage and grid technology. That position is going to make you unpopular with parts of your own party, George observed. I'm not here to be popular, George. I'm here to solve problems. If people want someone who's just going to tell them what they want to hear, they should look elsewhere. The truth is, our energy policy has been driven by ideology on both sides. One side pretends climate change isn't real. The other side pretends we can shut down fossil fuels tomorrow without massive economic disruption. Both positions are divorced from reality. George leaned back, seeming to reassess his approach. You've criticized government inefficiency repeatedly, but you're seeking to become part of that government. How do you reform a system from the inside when you're part of the problem? By being honest about what government can and can't do well, Bessent answered. Government is essential for providing public goods, enforcing rules, and addressing market failures. But it's terrible at picking winners and losers, managing complex operations, and responding quickly to changing circumstances. So we should focus government on what it does well and rely on markets for the rest. That means strong antitrust enforcement but not industrial policy. It means robust safety nets but not permanent dependency. It means investment in basic research, but letting the private sector commercialize innovations. Critics would say that's just standard conservative ideology dressed up as pragmatism, George challenged. And they'd be wrong, Bessent replied firmly. Standard conservative ideology says government is always the problem. I'm saying government has important roles, but it needs to stay in its lane. Standard conservative ideology opposes redistribution. I'm saying we need better designed redistribution that helps people build wealth rather than just subsidizing consumption. Standard conservative ideology fetishizes balanced budgets. I'm saying we